We should probably get started because, as T.S. Eliot says, April is the cruelest month, and it's particularly true for us academics, particularly true for academics in a year that had record snowfall. And I unfortunately have to run off to a 5 p.m. class to teach that normally would be long gone by this time of the year. But maybe we can get started. Your Excellency Archbishop O'Brien, Secretary Gottemüller, General Burns, honored guests, professors, Institute fellows, our dear students, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this afternoon's very important discussion of the ethics of the Obama administration's nuclear weapons policy. And thank you all for your interest in this critical topic. My name is Steve Schneck, and I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies here at the Catholic University of America, and we are the co-sponsor with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops of this afternoon's event. The Institute is an academic think tank, and we're charged to consider the timely questions of public policy from the rich resources of Catholic social and moral teachings. Presently, the Institute has about 40 fellows from nearly a dozen disciplines, coming not only from the Catholic University of America, but drawing as well researchers from other institutions around the country. And in all honesty, I can think of no contemporary issue of public policy that better fits our mission, the mission of the Institute, than today's event. The danger of nuclear weapons is not quaint or old-fashioned, reduced to boomer generation stories about hiding under desks during nuclear war drills. There are more than 23,000 strategic nuclear weapons still scattered around the world. And even the small ones, the smallest ones, the Hiroshima-sized ones, can reduce our cities to ash and release radiation and debris into the atmosphere with consequences that will last for generations. 9/11 would pale in significance to even one urban nuclear attack. For Catholics, moreover, let it be noted that such weapons are, almost by definition, weapons that challenge the most basic principles of our teachings on just war, challenging our ancient Christian concerns about proportionality, about the protection of non-combatants, and about the employment of inhumane means. Increasingly, too, the command and control mechanisms for such weapons are becoming worrisome again, worrisome around the world as weapons continue to be developed and deployed by nations without long-established procedures, security mechanisms, and technologies, such as were developed between East and West during the tensions of the Cold War. I think we've all heard these worries before. Worries abound about terrorist acquisition of such weapons. It's welcome, then, at this historical moment, that the Roman Catholic Church has again insisted, that the world's nuclear powers begin a process that in time will mean the elimination of these weapons. The Obama administration has acted too, beginning efforts for a new round of weapons reductions vis-a-vis Russia, the so-called START treaty that has yet to be ratified. And most recently, the administration has brought to Washington a gathering of the world's nuclear powers to discuss issues of management, security, proliferation, and reduction. His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI spoke to the Vatican's assembled diplomats this year in January in hopes, and I quote from His Holiness, that concrete decisions will be made toward progressive disarmament with a view to freeing our planet from nuclear arms. And just a few weeks ago, here in the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops President, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, spoke for the conference, saying, and again I quote, that it is a moral imperative to rid the world of nuclear weapons. It is then with great hopes that we convene today's discussion of the ethics of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
We'll be going in the order on our program here today, and we'll try to keep the introductions brief so we'll have more room for question and answer. Our first speaker is His Excellency Edwin Frederick O'Brien. He's the 15th Archbishop of Baltimore. This is he's the 15th ordinary of the nation's oldest see at the Cathedral of Our Mary, Our Queen. And prior to that assignment, he was the Archbishop of the Archdiocese for Military Services of the United States from 1997 until 2007. One thing you might not know about Archbishop O'Brien, he was also the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Baltimore last year. So he will lead us off today.
And for an Irish parade, it was very peaceful. Thank you, Marianne. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Catholic University, where I lived for, 7 years before transferring to Baltimore in Curley Hall. It's a timely discussion, as has been mentioned, on our nuclear weapons policy. I thank Dr. Cusimano-Love for organizing this afternoon's event, and for the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies for hosting us. We are fortunate to have with us Assistant Secretary of State Rose Gottemüller, the chief negotiator of the new START Treaty, an important achievement for our nation and the world, and also Dr. William Barbieri, the Director of the Peace and Justice Studies Program here at the Catholic University. It's an area of study that holds great promise for evaluating war with the entirely new attitude called for by the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to participate in a public forum with Dr. Cusimano-Love and General William Burns. They are well known to me from their generous service as consultants to our Bishops' Committee on International Justice and Peace, of which I am a member. With three of us panelists affiliated with the Bishops' International Committee, it almost seems like we have kind of stacked the deck, but I assure you'll find that we bring different perspectives to the question. At least that is what I have always experienced during my lively conversations with them in committee. Earlier in my ministry, I served as a chaplain to members of the armed forces and then as Archbishop for the military services before Pope Benedict appointed me as Archbishop of Baltimore almost 3 years ago. I come here today as a Catholic bishop, a longtime pastor to the military and their families, to offer some modest reflections on the moral dimensions of nuclear weapons policy. With our Bishop Conference, I am often a defender of the proper role of military action and a skeptic of naive hopes for peace in a still dangerous world. I have been on battlefields, I know the devastation of war, and I have great respect for our military institutions and for the men and women who serve in them. In this talk, I will offer moral considerations, certainly not easy answers. I bring the voice of a pastor and teacher, not as an expert analyst or policymaker. Addressing the critical issue of nuclear weapons is not new for our Catholic Church. Almost 45 years ago, the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council unequivocally condemned total war and what we would now call weapons of mass destruction. They solemnly declared, and I quote, "Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities or extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation." The Church, end quote. The Church's moral teaching on nuclear weapons has a long history. It grows out of a deep and abiding commitment to protect human life that is rooted in the teachings of Jesus, who said, "I am the way and the truth and the life," and whose mission was that we might have life and have it more abundantly. It is a teaching rooted in the fifth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Our Church works consistently to defend life and the dignity of all, unborn children, poor persons, vulnerable immigrants, and persons in every age and condition of life. This moral commitment to protecting human life led to the adoption and development of the Church's just war teaching, a teaching that makes war a last resort and places limits on the use of military force. It is a tradition that complements the gospel imperative of peacemaking. Fathers of the Council were also profoundly skeptical of the long-term efficacy of deterrence as a basis for peace. They argued that, quote, "The arms race is not a safe way to preserve a steady peace, nor is the so-called balance resulting from this race a sure and authentic peace, unquote. They concluded that, quote, "The arms race is an utterly treacherous trap for humanity and one which ensnares the poor to an intolerable degree," end quote. The Council called for multilateral, verifiable disarmament as a surer path to true peace. Popes of the modern era have applied this moral tradition to nuclear weapons and the deterrence policy for decades. As a permanent observer to the United Nations, the Holy See has ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and actively participated in the treaty's review conferences over the past 4 decades. For our part, the Catholic bishops of the United States examined U.S. nuclear policy in light of our moral tradition, most notably in Pastoral Letters of 1983, The Challenge of Peace. 10 years later, The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace, as well as in continuing public statements and advocacy with public officials. The aims of just war teaching are to reduce recourse to military force and to restrain the damage done by war. Some of its principles are especially applicable to nuclear weapons. For instance, the use of force must be discriminate. Civilians and civilian facilities may not be the object of direct, intentional attack, and care must be taken to avoid and minimize indirect harm to citizens. Again, the use of force must be proportionate. The overall destruction must not outweigh the good to be achieved. And finally, there must be a probability of success. Nuclear warfighting is rejected in church teaching because it cannot ensure non-combatant immunity, and the likely destruction and lingering radiation would violate the principle of proportionality. The real risks inherent in nuclear war make the probability of success elusive. In his 2006 World Day of Peace message, Pope Benedict declared starkly, "In a nuclear war, there would be no victors, only victims." Even the use of so-called mini-nukes would likely lower the barrier to future uses and could lead to indiscriminate and disproportionate harm. And the continuing possession of nuclear weapons undermines non-proliferation efforts and contributes to the danger of loose nuclear materials falling into the hands of terrorists. In Catholic teaching, the ethics of deterrence, disarmament, non-proliferation, and peace are profoundly linked. Our nation and world must have the courage and vision to move beyond deterrence. Disarmament and non-proliferation give impetus to building other structures to preserve peace and defend the tranquility of order. Ultimately, this tranquilitas ordinis is peace built on justice and charity. Pope John Paul II used the memorable image, quote, "Like a cathedral, peace has to be constructed patiently and with unshakable faith." Disarmament by the nuclear powers reinforces non-proliferation efforts with other nations. Securing, reducing, and eliminating nuclear weapons and materials is important for state actors, but it is even more critical that non-state actors be denied access to nuclear materials. Terrorists cannot be deterred through the possession of nuclear weapons. The threat of nuclear terrorism can only be reduced through disarmament and the securing of nuclear materials. At the 2005 review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Vatican made its position on nuclear deterrence clear. Quote, "When the Holy See expressed its limited acceptance of nuclear deterrence during the Cold War, it was with the clearly stated condition that deterrence was only a step on the way toward progressive nuclear disarmament. The Holy See has never countenanced nuclear deterrence as a permanent measure, nor does it today when it is evident that nuclear deterrence drives the development of ever newer nuclear arms, thus preventing genuine nuclear disarmament," end quote. Nuclear deterrence is too precarious and dangerous as a basis for peace. Deterrence cannot build genuine peace. It can only bring what the Church calls peace of a sort. Real and lasting peace can only be built on the foundations of justice and human rights, on mutual interests and concerns. This is the kind of lasting peace the world needs, the kind of peace that Germany and France and the United States and Japan built on the ashes of World War II. How might we evaluate current U.S. nuclear policy from a moral perspective? It is important to judge each policy action from the perspective of the end we seek. The Greek word for end is telos. In the words of Pope John Paul II, the moral life has an essential teleological character, end quote. In Catholic moral teaching, the end does not justify the means, but the end can and should shape the means we employ. When it comes to nuclear weapons policy, the end is the protection of the life and dignity of the human person. In a moral analysis of nuclear weapons policies programs, it is important to start with the end and work backwards. The moral end is clear: a world free of the threat of nuclear weapons. This goal should guide our efforts. Every nuclear weapon system and every nuclear weapons policy should be judged by the ultimate goal of protecting human life and dignity, and the related goal of ridding the world of these weapons in mutually verifiable ways. Although we must always keep our eyes on the horizon of a world without nuclear weapons, it is equally important to focus our next steps, because the journey is long and dangerous, and we must take one step at a time if we are to be successful. In a recent letter to President Obama, Francis Cardinal George, the president of our conference, outlined some of the steps along the way to a world free of nuclear threat. He noted the United States should work to verifiably reduce nuclear arsenals, as the New START Treaty continues to do, ratify and bring into force the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, reduce our nation's reliance on nuclear weapons for security, as the new Nuclear Posture Review begins to do, secure nuclear materials from terrorists, as this month's Nuclear Security Summit aimed to do, adopt a fissile material cutoff treaty to prohibit production of weapons-grade material, and finally, strengthen the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor non-proliferation efforts and ensure access to peaceful uses of nuclear power. Each of these steps takes us in the direction of a nuclear weapons-free world. Now let me add a few reflections regarding the New START Treaty and the Nuclear Posture Review. Our Conference of Bishops is urging members of the Senate to come together across party lines to ratify the New START Treaty. As the experts on this panel can tell you in more detail, the New START Treaty reduces deployed strategic warheads, limits the United States and Russia to fewer delivery vehicles, and includes new verification requirements. This arms reduction treaty is a significant yet modest step in the right direction and sets the stage for future reductions. Likewise, the Nuclear Posture Review represents a significant yet modest shift toward a world free of nuclear weapons. It does not go as far as the bishops urged. It does not declare that the sole purpose of the U.S. nuclear arsenal is to deter nuclear attack against us or our allies. But the Nuclear Posture Review embraces the goal of a world without nuclear weapons, recognizes the danger of nuclear terrorism, and narrows the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear threats and against non-nuclear states that are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and in compliance with their nuclear non-proliferation obligations. These directions are morally sound, but more progress is needed to meet our moral responsibilities to rid the world of this disproportionate and indiscriminate threat to human life. As bishops, we are pastors and teachers, not technical experts. We cannot map out the precise route to the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons, but we can offer moral direction and encouragement. Although we cannot anticipate every step on the path humanity must walk, we can point with moral clarity to a destination that moves beyond deterrence to a world free of nuclear threat. It will not be easy. Nuclear weapons can be dismantled, but both the human knowledge and the technical capability to build weapons cannot be erased. A world with zero nuclear weapons will need robust measures to monitor, enforce, and verify compliance. The path to zero will be long and treacherous, but humanity has a moral obligation to walk this path with both care and courage. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Our next speaker is Assistant Secretary of State Rose Gottemoeller. She is the Assistant Secretary for Verification, Compliance, and Implementation. And as you've heard, she was a chief negotiator on this New START Treaty. Prior to that, she served also at the Energy Department as the Deputy Undersecretary for Defense for Nuclear Nonproliferation, and also the Assistant Secretary at the Energy Department as well for Nonproliferation and National Security. She also served at the Carnegie Endowment. But what you may not know about Assistant Secretary Gottmeier is that she received her BA from Georgetown University, yet we do not hold it against her, and we're very happy that she's come across town to join us here today. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also thank you for the invitation here today. Indeed, it's a great pleasure to appear here at Catholic University, and I welcome the opportunity very, very much. I just got back from Geneva 2 weeks ago. We had a very long, hard, intensive negotiation with the Russians, but I will point out that it was a little bit faster than past negotiations. We got to yes in this negotiation in about 12 months' time, from start to finish, from April 24th, 2009, when we started, to April 24th, 2010, last Saturday, when I got a note from Geneva. My technical team was there finishing up some final details to really sew up the technical annexes that are the implementation details for the treaty, and they wrote me to say, congratulations, we did it in 1 year's time. So it was a big, big step, and I think a big step on the road. I very much liked Archbishop O'Brien's line just now when he said the goal overall of Catholic teaching and Catholic doctrine on this matter is that a world free of nuclear weapons should drive our policy one step at a time. And I will say that that is the view of President Obama as well. In fact, it was almost a year to the day before President Obama came to Prague on the 8th of April to sign the START treaty that he gave a very important speech in Prague, where he talked about the goal of U.S. policy as being moving toward a world free of nuclear weapons. He talked about the challenges posed by the risk of proliferation of those weapons, and he, for U.S. policy, articulated a bold vision that we should work in every way we can to seek the peace and security of a world free of nuclear weapons, no matter how hard it might be or how long it might take. The President amplified these remarks at the signing ceremony for the treaty, and I was able to be with the President in Prague, with President Medvedev, with my counterpart, and with the senior members of our negotiating team. And I have to say that it's not often in life, working in Washington anyway, that one experiences a thrill of that kind, but to see the fruits of our labor come together in Prague and for President Obama and President Medvedev to sign the treaty was indeed a great thrill for me and for my counterparts who were working on the negotiation over the last year. But the President said during his remarks at Prague that ridding the world of nuclear weapons must be a long-term goal. He said, it may not be one that will be achieved in my lifetime, but, and I quote, I believe then, as I do now, that the pursuit of that goal will move us further beyond the Cold War, strengthen the global nonproliferation regime, and make the United States and the world safer and more secure. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the President also affirmed that the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary and guarantee the defense of our allies. But I want to underscore, and I'll come back to this at the end of my remarks, with the New START treaty, we are setting the stage for further arms reductions. Just as Archbishop O'Brien said, it is indeed a modest step. It is a transitional step. START went out of force in December of 2009. There is now not an arms control treaty in place between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. So START went out of force, and we knew when the Obama administration came into office that we needed a bridge, a transitional document to carry us from the START treaty to an era of further reductions, deeper reductions, and that is a goal that President Obama has clearly laid out. So in the START treaty, we are setting the stage for further reductions. As we say in the preamble to the treaty, we see it as providing new impetus to the step-by-step process of reducing and limiting nuclear arms, with a view to expanding this process in the future to a multilateral approach. Very important. That involves the other nuclear weapons states under the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the UK, France, China, and it also involves those states who are not now signatories to the NPT, Pakistan, India, the states that we are most concerned about will also have to be engaged eventually in this goal, Iran and North Korea. So you can see what a difficult task we have ahead of us, but it's important to set the work in motion, and I think that's what we are about now. So we will seek to include non-strategic and non-deployed nuclear weapons in future reductions, as well as seeking to involve other countries in the process. And I think we will be heading to a point where we will truly be taking arms control into a new era, where it's not just a bilateral measure between us and the Soviet Union, us and the Russian Federation, but involving a multilateral process. We are looking forward with great anticipation to the NPT Review Conference, which begins next week in New York City. I believe that heading into the conference, the New START Treaty sets a very powerful example of responsible U.S.-Russian leadership in managing and reducing our remaining nuclear arsenals. Along with the recent release of the Nuclear Posture Review, which de-emphasizes the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. national security strategy, and the strong communique that was issued at the close of the Nuclear Security Summit in mid-April here in Washington, the treaty is a key to strengthening the global nonproliferation regime. The New START Treaty, however, is not just about Washington and Moscow. It is about the entire world community. While the treaty is bilateral, it has big implications for global security because the United States and Russia control more than 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. We know that the world is, not perhaps as focused on these nuclear problems as it should be, but it looks to the United States and Russia for leadership in securing nuclear materials globally and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons overall. Thus, the new treaty sets the stage for engaging other powers in fulfilling the goals of the NPT in general, whether they are nuclear weapon states or non-nuclear weapon states who nevertheless have fissile material or nuclear material that is associated with peaceful nuclear energy programs, for example. So we feel that we have thereby, through the treaty that we have just negotiated, the opportunity for moral leadership in this important area. At the upcoming Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, we will be reaffirming each party's commitment to that treaty and to strengthening its three pillars: non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. In addition, we want to discourage abuses of the treaty withdrawal provision and ensure that there is a strong focus on NPT compliance. That said, the NPT Review Conference is not an end in itself, but a milestone toward enhancing the non-proliferation regime worldwide. There are two major goals that the Obama administration is pursuing, and again, Archbishop O'Brien has referred to them already, in addition to further nuclear reductions. One is bringing the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty into force, the CTBT as it's called, and negotiating a verifiable fissile material cutoff treaty, FMCT. Ratifying the CTBT will not be an easy task, but we will be working closely with the Senate and the public and key stakeholders to achieve that goal. And by the way, the first task we have before us is ratifying the START Treaty. So this year we'll be preoccupied focusing on getting the START Treaty through the Senate and getting the Russians as well to ratify the treaty in their State Duma. We have the feeling it's going to be a little easier on their side of the ocean than it is on ours, but nonetheless, they too will have a process of ratifying the treaty. We will also work to reduce the materials needed to produce nuclear weapons. Achieving a verifiable fissile material cutoff treaty is an essential condition for a world free of nuclear weapons. If the international community is serious about drawing down, we must constrain the ability to build up, and that means placing constraints on the production of fissile materials that can be used for nuclear weapons. So we are working hard on this matter, and it is a matter that is being worked on a multilateral basis in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, the so-called CD. When I was in Geneva working on this negotiation with my Russian colleagues, the CD teams were very hard at work on trying to get a fissile material cutoff treaty negotiation going. There are some problems there, some barriers, but nevertheless I'm hopeful that we can get moving on it. So each of these steps will move us closer to President Obama's vision of reducing and ultimately eliminating nuclear weapons. Before I close my remarks, I'd like to say just a few added words about the START Treaty and its role as a transitional agreement. It is a foundation for further reductions and further deep reductions, and I think it sets in place a good foundation stone for further reductions in the nuclear arena. First of all, the way we are counting under this treaty is new and different from in the past, when both the United States and the Soviet Union had thousands and thousands of weapons. We could afford to be a little bit relaxed about how we counted the nuclear systems under these two treaties. For example, under the START Treaty that was just concluded, we came down from 12,000 deployed warheads on both sides to 6,000 deployed warheads. So you could see 20 years ago when START came into force, we had a great deal of flex because of the fact that we both had a lot of nuclear weapons that were deployed. Now we're getting down to much lower numbers. Under this new treaty, we will be down to 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads on the Russian side and on the U.S. side. That's still a lot. It's still too much. But nevertheless, it now means that we have to focus in more precisely on how we count those warheads. And for that reason, for the first time ever in a treaty, we are counting warheads on missiles. In the past, if we could see that a missile had been tested with 10 warheads, we said, okay, every time we see that missile, we'll count it with 10 warheads, no matter what. But you see that a lot of imprecision came about because of that, particularly as over time we began putting fewer warheads on missiles. So under this new treaty, we are focusing down and focusing on warheads on missiles, counting them more precisely, and also verifying them more precisely. The verification regime under this new treaty will allow for on-site inspections that will focus more precisely, again, on the number of warheads on missiles. So that is a very important, I think, step forward, a very important innovation under this treaty, and it is one that we can build on in the future as we move to deeper and deeper reductions. And the last thing I wanted to mention about is the notification regime under the new treaty. It will be tracing the weapon systems from the cradle to the grave and really following very, very closely how they are moving from production facilities to deployment to maintenance facilities for refurbishment or for repair work, and making sure that they are traced constantly throughout their life cycle so that we know exactly where they are. And then we have an opportunity in the future, again, to focus down to smaller and smaller numbers, finer and finer granularity, because we will have that kind of information shared between the two parties. And that's what is an essential aspect of this new treaty, is the predictability that it brings about between Russia and the United States, and the predictability that will be needed to go to deeper and deeper reductions over time. So I hope that you will have an opportunity to watch this process unfold in your lifetime, and that by the time we get down to a few hundred, it won't be so long in the future, but by that time we'll have ultimate predictability, and also the relationship between the United States and Russia will be such that we will have the ability to think about them in a different way, not in terms of a mutual deterrence relationship, but a relationship of mutual assured stability. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to get to introduce my colleague, Marianne Cusimano-Love. She is an associate professor in our Department of Politics here at the Catholic University of America. She is also a fellow of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies. And we have missed her very much this year, as she has been on a sabbatical of sorts at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She is the mother of 3 beautiful children, and something that you might not know about Dr. Cusimano-Love is that she is a published and very well-reviewed children's book author. I'm not sure if that comes out of her children or out of her work.
I'm going to try to take this out here. There we go. I've been told by our AV people that they want to hear us. But I'm going to use pictures because I write picture books, so pictures are good with me. I want to thank you all for coming, especially the students. I know this is your last week of classes, and finals loom large, and papers loom large, but so do these issues. So thank you for being here with us. I'm going to make 3 points today. First is that controlling nuclear weapons is not only the job of governments. So one of the reasons we're having this discussion at Catholic University and having it open to the public is to think about what are all of our responsibilities for the control of nuclear weapons. We all have moral obligations and important contributions to make to build peace, and basically this mission is too important to leave up to governments. So if you want the status quo, leave it up to the governments. If you think we need some change, well, we all need to be on board. So basically the challenge of peace that the bishops wrote still applies, and that's what the first part of my talk will be about. But secondly, the second point I want to make is that things have changed. They've changed since the last START treaty obviously was negotiated, but also they've changed since the challenge of peace was written. The current period of globalization changes arms control with private proliferation networks, with non-state actors, and also with global climate change. We might not think of these issues as linked, but they are. And so our moral frameworks really have to catch up to those global changes in business practices. And that was something that the Pope noted in his Caritas in Veritate encyclical this summer. And finally, we all have important opportunities to influence global politics now. So I do think there's hope here through transnational advocacy networks. So if globalization and non-state actors without ethical frameworks are part of the problem in non-state proliferation, globalization and non-state actors working with an ethical framework, working in favor of the common good, can be part of the solution. And I think from a religious background, we bring a particular point of a positive point with that, because we come knowing that nothing is impossible with God. So we definitely can move these issues forward. One thing, the Archbishop noted the importance of the document Challenge, the Challenge of Peace, that the bishops wrote over 25 years ago. That document's most often noted for what it had to say about nuclear deterrence. But I think one very important part of it that's often less noted is the bishops saying peacemaking is not an optional commitment, but it is a requirement of our faith. And also that they really called everybody out in that document. So no one was left off the hook, and they said we all have moral obligations to build peace at the international level, the national, the church, the community, and the individual levels. And I think those are points that are often forgotten in this discussion that are worth remembering. The bishops were criticized at the time for being overly naive, and really they were quite prescient. Everything they discussed in that document has come to pass. They imagined that a better world was both possible and necessary. Shortly after they wrote that document, the Berlin Wall came tumbling down. And as Archbishop O'Brien said, much of what was written in that document has now come to pass in the Obama administration's policies. So calling for deep cuts in nuclear weapons. As the Cold War's height, there were over 60,000 nuclear weapons. Today we're at 23,000, and the new treaty will bring those numbers quite down. Of course, the numbers of 3,100 between the U.S. and Russia do not account, as Assistant Secretary said, tactical and other weapons. They also called for CTBT, which is under discussion today. The bishops also called for new types of political authority, new types of global authority, adequate to the needs of the international common good. Again, a theme that we saw in the papal encyclical last summer. So, in the movements that we saw in the nuclear security conference that was here 2 weeks ago, we see those movements towards trying to create new authorities and new negotiations around control of fissile materials. So the U.S. and Russia have agreed to convert 68 tons of plutonium, enough for 17,000 nuclear bombs, from decommissioned weapons into energy. The Ukrainians have also agreed to abolish their highly enriched uranium within the next 2 years. And in a related measure, we've been looking to try to secure a highly enriched uranium in energy facilities around the world. And Chile the U.S. has worked with Chile to remove material there both before and after the earthquake. So they were in the middle of this process when the earthquake hit. And that required them to change course and change the way they would ship the material out of the country because the port was no longer accessible because of the earthquake. But luckily, they were able to complete that process. So really, the bishops led the way, and I think we all need to lead the way again in this discussion when we talk about what are the next steps between also ratifying the START Treaty and moving beyond it. But the second point that I wanted to raise today is that things have changed. Things have changed since the bishops wrote the Challenge of Peace letter. Globalization facilitates both private proliferations and networks and global climate change. And we don't like to think about either of these issues because they are catastrophic. We've kind of come up with two different ways we can end life on the planet as we know it in the past century, so we've been busy. And we also don't like to think of those issues as connected. We think of global climate change as an environmental issue and nuclear issues as a military security issue. We don't like to think about these issues because they make us feel helpless and they make us feel hopeless. But I would submit to you that we are neither. We are neither helpless or hopeless. We are vulnerable, but I don't think that has to be a moment for existential despair in the face of these concerns. I think that's a moment for us as people of faith to invite the Holy Spirit in and admit that we do not have all the answers here, so we need to work together, and we also need to work within our faith traditions. We mistakenly think these issues of global climate change and control of nuclear materials and nuclear weapons are the government's job. And we point fingers to the Obama administration, to presidents, to the United Nations, that they should take care of these things. But that's not the world we're in today. And one of the problems is that many of the treaties that Assistant Secretary discussed really look at the control of nuclear weapons and materials as being the job of governments. So the nuclear proliferation, the non-proliferation treaty that the conference will be occurring in the month of May up in New York to review that treaty envisions states as being the actors that would be proliferating nuclear weapons and materials. And that is not the world that we live in today. The world we live in today is, the poster child for it is this man here. This is A.Q. Khan. He's widely revered in Pakistan as the father of the Pakistani nuclear weapons program. He's also the world's worst nuclear proliferator. He was the mastermind behind a network that sold systems and dual-use materials and technologies to North Korea, Iran, Syria, Libya, and I have a question mark there because we don't really know who else. In 2004, under great international pressure, the Musharraf regime put him under house arrest in Pakistan. And again, that was the extent of his punishment because he was considered such a hero within Pakistan. But with the change of administrations in Pakistan, he is out of house arrest. He is a free man. If you want to check him out, check out his website where you can try to contact him, ask for his advice, for his services. This is the type of challenge that we face now. Non-state actors working with globalization, with the benefits of globalization, but working only for a profit motive, not for a common good motive. So we have these problems with loose nuclear materials, as the Nuclear Security Summit highlighted 2 weeks ago. We know that Pakistani nuclear weapons scientists met with al-Qaeda. We know that the United States has lost at least 11 nuclear bombs, lost during the Cold War. That's what has been documented and has been admitted by the Department of Defense. Of course, the numbers may be quite larger, and some estimates are much larger than that. In 2007, 4 gunmen attacked a South African site with enough highly enriched uranium for 12 atomic bombs. The attackers escaped. It was unclear what their motives were, but those were in lightly guarded civilian nuclear energy sites, and those are the concerns that those types of sites around the world are quite vulnerable. And we know that the Iranians have also been trying to hire former Soviet weapons scientists the day after the Soviet Union ceased to exist and became the Russian Federation. The faxes were quite busy as the Iranians were faxing job offers to those weapons scientists, something that Assistant Secretary Gottmeier worked on, an issue she worked on when she was at the Energy Department in the 1990s. So those change the face of proliferation, and they need to change our response to these issues as well. And global climate change changes these issues as well. We know that countries are looking at how to come up with non-carbon-based economies. They're concerned about providing energy. There's great interest in the pursuit of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Right now, there is a race in the Middle East to acquire nuclear energy, and we know that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Jordan, Egypt, and Yemen all are committed to developing nuclear energy programs for their countries. Now, this leads to the concern, because as you can see from that list of states, many of those states are not stable countries. Their governments are not stable, and so you could have the creation of more Pakistans, more countries which have unstable governments, which have control over nuclear materials as well as energy. So we need to change the way we think about these issues. Oops, we have a little technical problem. We need to change the way we think about these issues, and that's one of the things that Pope was talking about in the encyclical last summer. He said in Caritas in Veritate that what we have are globalization and global markets, but we do not have common ethical commitments that undergird those common global markets. And we don't have ethical commitments that are to the common good, to promotion of the common good. And basically that is the sort of system that we have now when we're looking at private proliferation networks. We're looking at business and governments we're looking at business networks that are not governed by common moral frameworks. So really, we all have moral responsibilities to close these gaps. That's something else the papal encyclical mentioned, that all economic activity has to serve the common good, but all of us have responsibilities to try to build these new moral frameworks to govern the global economy. So I've been asked to not leave us on a hopeless tack, but to provide some information about what we can do about this. So if we all have moral responsibilities, and if globalization provides new challenges, how can globalization also provide new opportunities for public engagement on these issues? First is we have to take responsibility and not just point fingers and say this is the government's responsibility, this is the United Nations' responsibility. We as citizens and we as people of faith have responsibilities here as well. So we have to not leave action to governments, but use the power of our values and the power of our networks, our civil society networks, to look at these issues. In universities, we can educate for peace, we can advocate, we can network using new technologies, and we can reframe the issues in moral, not technical terms. That's been very, very effective in other issue areas, so we can remember and build on our successful track record. So I'm not just talking pie in the sky here. We have a very proven track record of being able to reframe issues in a moral framework and get traction on political issues that were thought previously quite difficult. So why am I hopeful? Why do I think that Catholic and other faith-based groups have a very historic opportunity now to importantly influence international politics? Because in an information age, ideas matter. With the increased availability and the decreased cost of information technologies, it makes it easier to broadcast than to suppress ideas and values. It makes it possible, easier, and cheaper to organize across distances, and it makes it much more difficult to suppress that. As former President Bill Clinton likes to say, it's like nailing Jell-O to a wall, efforts to try to stop the flow of information across borders. You can try, and there are certainly regimes out there, repressive regimes, that are trying to stop those flows of information and advocacy across borders, but it's very difficult to do. In a 24/7 information environment, the little guys can be unleashed. Symbols, values, and pictures matter. And it gives us new opportunities to practice what I like to call resurrection politics, to take issues that are thought previously dead on arrival, like nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation, to reframe these issues using values and powerful images, and that changes the political space by drawing on the language and symbols of faith. We can engage in shame and name, transparency politics, Dracula politics, because there are some practices in international politics that are so pernicious that merely shining a light on them, like the AQCon network, can be enough to stop those practices or to shut them down. We have a history, a track record where Catholic institutions and norms have been quite effective in influencing secular institutions. So from just war tradition, which the Archbishop mentioned, to current examples in human trafficking, in banning anti-personnel landmines, banning cluster weapons and munitions. We have many, many examples when we've been effective in doing this. So I would just close with saying we need to remember, as the bishops did, that peace is possible, peace is practical, and peace is our calling. And nothing, really nothing, is impossible with God. So I'll leave it to you, the students here, to take up this challenge because this is the world all of us are going to be living in the future. Thank you. Our next speaker is General Burns. And he is an Arms Control Association board member. He's a distinguished fellow at the Army War College, but he's also was formerly the director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and served as the U.S. first special envoy to denuclearization negotiations with the former Soviet countries under the non-Lugar legislation. Something you may not know about General Burns is that he and his wife are grandparents to 9 grandchildren, and parents to 4 sons, all of whom are quite accomplished, but one of whom is the other Bill Burns in Washington, who's the Undersecretary of State at the State Department. So thank you, General Burns, for coming today.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I'd like to do 2 things. I'd like to talk a little bit about where we've come from, and then a bit about where I think we may be going and what the issues confronting us as we go will be. First, let me say that I spent my first 25 years in the Army working with nuclear weapons. Commanded at battery, battalion, and brigade level, and I think I commanded one way or another units with every nuclear weapon that the Army had over a period of 25 years. My next 25 years was spent trying to figure out how to get rid of them. The first 25 years were interesting from a number of perspectives. When we received nuclear weapons in the mid-50s, the policy of the United States was massive retaliation. It was all you could do with nuclear weapons because of the design and the characteristics and the relatively low technology of nuclear weapons of the day. They were basically the Hiroshima bomb, the Nagasaki bomb. And these weapons were evolved into tactical weapons, and tactical weapons simply meant that weapons that were smaller than the big weapons. They were not really defined too well beyond that. And our policy was to deploy tactical weapons to Europe to offset the preponderance which we believed the Soviet side and the Warsaw Pact had in conventional weapons. Sounds sort of familiar today, doesn't it? I know some Russians who make the same argument. They need tactical nuclear weapons because of the preponderance of the West in conventional armaments. In the mid-70s, I was commanding a brigade in Europe, had about 100 nuclear delivery systems among 5 battalions. One was a British a British artillery missile unit. And at the time, we were spending a great deal of effort in developing new war plans. And one of the most interesting things I found was that senior commanders, corps commanders, 3- and 4-star generals, we're finding less and less utility in nuclear weapons. Because, you know, when you really sit down and think about a tactical weapon, you set it off, and you generally, if you wait until they attack, you're setting it off on friendly territory. And after a while, the German government started to ask interesting questions about what we were going to do with these nuclear weapons. We had a weapon called an atomic demolition munition, which you buried in the ground and set off as the Soviet forces came over it. And this was next to German villages. And the German villagers wondered what we were putting in the holes. These all were quietly removed because obviously it was a very good idea perhaps, but it had gone terribly bad. One of the interesting things about maneuvers in those days, and fortunately that's the only time we were able to plan to use nuclear weapons, can't think of a maneuver in a period of about 10 years where the commanders ever decided to do nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are carried around by units and all that. And usually at the end of the exercise, they would declare the exercise ended, and then they would come up with a fictitious situation where nuclear weapons were used just so the staffs would have practice in planning them. But the Army realized more and more that nuclear weapons at that level didn't make too much sense, and in 1991, President Bush the Elder agreed, and tactical nuclear weapons were basically removed from Europe. The Army got rid of all its tactical nuclear weapons, and the Air Force most of them. I think it's interesting to note that a president has taken a principled stand on the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons, and the U.S. president and the Russian president agreed to this principled stand of basically going to zero. They've signed an important treaty to reduce substantially offensive nuclear weapons under strict verification and mutual inspection conditions. But they have been stymied by the issue of what to do about defenses against nuclear-tipped missiles. Of course, I'm speaking of President Reagan and President Gorbachev. I say that simply to point out that for 25 years, presidents of the United States of various political persuasions and various parties and at various times have basically made the assumption that the fewer nuclear weapons we have, the better. It's significant that, as Secretary Gadamuller has pointed out very well, we are continuing the process today in a New START treaty. Let me talk about where we might be going with all this. If we are able to ratify the START treaty, and I think we will be able to, and I think we can, and if we ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which I think is extremely important, and if we ratify a treaty on fissile material cutoff, which I think is equally important, we'll go a long way to get a handle on remaining nuclear weapons. Now, there are organizations that press for a so-called global zero. And I think it's important that global zero remain out there because it has to be the goal. The problem, of course, is that there are many, many stumbling blocks between now, where we have reduced to a relatively small number of weapons compared to the Cold War. When you compare that to zero, there's a tremendous gap to fill. First of all nuclear powers must agree, obviously, to zero. Not just the 5 nuclear powers in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the 2 declared nuclear powers in South Asia, the undeclared nuclear power in Israel, and then the 2 budding wannabe nuclear powers in North Korea and Iran, and then other countries or entities that might attempt to develop a nuclear capability in the future. The international community must accept an absolute ban on further proliferation that can be enforceable. and this is a big bite. There must be absolute controls, including draconian sanctions. I'm talking about a different kind of world. I'm talking about a world where if nuclear weapons have been abolished and a country acquires nuclear weapons, then that country loses its independence. It's no longer recognized by the United Nations, and military action would be taken to suppress that government and create another entity there. This is draconian, but I think it'd be necessary. We have to be careful as we reduce nuclear weapons that we remember that there are both intentions and capabilities. I'm not particularly moved by a country that says we won't use nuclear weapons first, because if they have the capability, if they have 20 nuclear weapons, they can change their policy tomorrow. However, if they don't have any nuclear weapons, it'll probably take them 10 to 20 years to build them. So I don't care what their intentions are, as long as they don't have the nuclear weapons. I think it's important that if we were to go to a nuclear zero as an objective, and we went to lower and lower levels of nuclear weapons, and then we were able to develop an international system which would prevent nations from acquiring nuclear weapons, we probably would need an international anti-ballistic missile system, a system which would control the launch of missiles for so-called peaceful purposes, to put a satellite up for communications purposes. There would have to be a regime in which a launch had to be announced sometime in advance. The day and the date would have to be set. The purpose would have to be announced. The range of the missile firing or carrying this load would have to be specified. And if a missile were launched without all this, then there would have to be an ABM system that could take it down in its boost phase. Now, we come a long ways in ABM systems. We haven't reached that point. I'm simply saying that as technology advances, we have to spend the money to develop those technologies which will help us in the end game of a zero nuclear weapons world. Another serious problem, of course, is nuclear weapons in the hands of entities that are not states. Nuclear deterrence does not work against Al-Qaeda or any other organization that acquires a 2-bit nuclear weapon and attempts to set it off. Nuclear deterrence doesn't work. We need a very sophisticated intelligence system so we know these things are going to happen, and then we have to have ways of dealing with them in ways that they do not, they are unable to use the nuclear device that they develop. One of the scariest scenarios, of course, is if the New York Times gets a call tomorrow morning and says, noon on Wednesday, we're going to set off a nuclear weapon someplace in New York City unless you do X, Y, and Z. You're the President of the United States. What are your actions and orders? You can't find a nuclear weapon in New York City in 24 hours. Furthermore, you don't know whether it's a hoax or not. Now, you can probably only have one hoax, but that could be a pretty scary hoax. Do you evacuate New York City? What are the priorities in evacuation? Can you do it without a major panic? These are all questions that would have to be answered in the future. Where do we go from here? It seems to me that it's important that agencies outside of the government help the government of whatever ilk work towards serious reductions in nuclear weapons. I think the USCCB has done a great job in doing that, and I think it will be called upon to do similar work in the future. There are other non-governmental agencies in the United States that can do this kind of work, and I think they need to be mobilized to achieve those things. We have to realize that in addition to the executive branch, which has just negotiated a treaty as an example, we have other branches of government, particularly the Congress and particularly the Senate, that needs to ratify arms control treaties as they ratify all treaties. But also, the House of Representatives has a role in foreign policy and certainly in military policy in appropriating money to buy weapons, including nuclear weapons. I think it's very interesting that there's a resolution which has been submitted in the House, House Resolution 278, which has been sponsored by two members of the House from different political parties from different parts of the country, but both Catholic. Jim McGovern of Massachusetts and Dan Lundgren of California. House Resolution 278 calls on the government to immediately begin negotiations to reduce nuclear weapons from the 1550 deployed warheads that are in the START Treaty to 1,000 warheads. But what the START Treaty doesn't do, put a cap of 3,000 warheads on non-deployed on the total inventory of U.S. warheads. Now, these numbers are symbolic as much as anything else, but I think it's important that we have seen resolutions like this submitted. There is a strong support of probably 10–15% of the House of Representatives now who have signed on as co-sponsors, and I think there's a fair chance that this measure will be adopted in the present Congress. It's symbolic, but it's also extremely important. The United States and the Russian Federation have had their ups and downs over the last 20 years. In 1991, I spent some time in the Soviet Union, left 2 days before Gorbachev resigned, and then 3 months later found myself heading a delegation to negotiate U.S. assistance for the dismantlement of weapons, nuclear weapons that have been specified as surplus under the START I treaty. Difficult negotiations because the new Russian government was not well established. They were trying to determine what flag they wanted, what coat of arms they wanted, and nuclear matters were something that were dealt with by the Ministry of Defense. Because there was no Ministry of Defense in the Russian Federation, the Ministry of Defense was in the Russian Republic, and so forth and so on. But the interesting part of all that was that the United States, for better or for worse, was able to work through that. We did provide something going on $3 billion worth of assistance, and not only were those weapons removed and destroyed under U.S. supervision, but we also were able to sign a separate agreement where we bought 500 tons of surplus highly enriched uranium that came out of nuclear weapons. And we were able to determine that this was actually from nuclear weapons through a verification process. And we were able to move the materials to the United States after it became low enriched uranium and used it in power plants. This was excess uranium nobody expected to have because nobody thought it would ever be taken out of weapons. And now we are discussing with the Russians elimination of plutonium from nuclear weapons in a similar way. The historians are going to ultimately have to decide whether or not nuclear weapons have actually kept the peace, as deterrence theory would suggest, over the roughly 7 decades since we began to build nuclear weapons. If they have, then we haven't had the wars of the 20th century into the 21st century. We have had no major wars among the great powers in over 6 decades. And the United States and the Russian Federation have moved from fierce hostility in the Cold War to grudging acceptance to a semblance of partnership. I think this is very important. The test of this generation and the next is whether or not we can mitigate the dangers of these very weapons as we reduce them to minimal levels with appropriate and necessary constraints on their use. Thank you.
Our cleanup batter tonight is Dr. Bill Barbieri. He's Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies and also a Fellow at the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies here at Catholic University. Some things you may not know about Bill Barbieri. He's got 4 very lively children, and he's a big soccer enthusiast, not just in playing soccer, which he's quite skilled at, but he also is doing research with soccer nationalism, bringing his passion for his sport to his academic life.
Soccer does have a contribution to make to world peace. That's a topic for another day, though. It's a great privilege to be here with a panel of such distinguished colleagues who are doing so much for what it turns out is a shared agenda of a nuclear-free world, an agenda that has acquired some interesting avatars in recent years, including folks like George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, William Perry, and Sam Nunn, who've all signed on to a common task, and they too, as I want to explore today, have lots more company. In my remarks, I want to touch on 3 topics. The first is the emergence of a broad ethical consensus, one that unites the just war and nonviolent strands of the Catholic community in support of what I'll be calling nuclear abolitionism. The second is an assessment from that standpoint, then, of the Obama administration's recent moves regarding nuclear policy. Finally, I, too, will address the shape of a Catholic abolitionist agenda for moving ahead. So my first topic, nuclear ethics and the cause of abolitionism. The ethics of nuclear policy. As we've already heard, there's some consensus that let me just put it in a nutshell. Nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons is immoral. What does that leave to discuss? It leaves to discuss the questions of how and when to work to rid the world of nuclear weapons. The ethics of nuclear policy itself encompass 2 major questions. First, the morality of the use of nuclear weapons, and second, the morality of deterrence. The most basic qualms about nukes and their prospective use are readily summarized. On the first question, one needn't invoke the prospect of Armageddon or nuclear winter to rule out the use of nuclear weapons, since they violate key principles of even a modest theory of just war, of the ethics of war, namely, as has already been mentioned, the criteria of proportionality and discrimination, or as it's more widely known, non-combatant immunity. On the second matter of nuclear deterrence, the chief ethical obstacle is this. In order to be credible, and hence viable, a deterrence policy must rely on an actual intention to use nuclear weapons should the appropriate circumstances arise. But because in ethics, an immoral intention is sufficient to invalidate an act, deterrence, understood as constituting a murderous threat, is a culpably immoral policy, quite apart from any beneficial consequences that it might produce. The intention is equivalent to the act, in other words. The famous analogy supplied by the great Protestant ethicist Paul Ramsey, whatever its other limitations, is illustrative of the problem. His example is this: a policy designed to limit traffic fatalities on Labor Day weekend would surely be found ethically wanting if it entailed binding live babies to automobile bumpers in order to prevent crashes. Think about that for a moment. Now, there's a third issue that involves the relationship between nuclear weapons and distributive justice that I'm going to leave for my closing remarks. But these ethical judgments about the immorality of the use of nuclear weapons and deterrence are hardly incontestable. There are, indeed, plausible grounds for suggesting, 1, that there might be forms of nuclear weapons whose application might be surgical enough to meet just war restrictions, and 2, we might still recognize that there's enough of a moral difference between the threat of the use of nuclear weapons and the actual use to provide the basis for some limited ethical defense of deterrence. It's instructive here, I think, to briefly consider 2 attempts along these lines that have been presented to justify some form of nuclear deterrence strategy. Those of the aforementioned Paul Ramsey, whom I invoke with some trembling since I happen to know that His Excellency the Archbishop wrote a dissertation about his ethics, and, as already mentioned, the U.S. Catholic bishops, who in their 1983 pastoral letter included a limited acceptance of deterrence. Now, Ramsey, to whom we have to give credit both for framing the debate for people of faith about nuclear weapons and for making a strong case for the principle of agape, or neighbor love, as a foundation for the ethics of war, he presented a complex argument that, while renouncing the first use of nuclear weapons or any targeting of population centers, his argument still held that defensive and retaliatory uses of counterforce nuclear weapons could provide the basis for an effective deterrence strategy. A key point in his theory was his contention that unintended yet foreseeable civilian casualties, acceptable under the principle of double effect from Catholic moral theology, could generate a successful deterrent without requiring immoral intentions. Now, there are numerous reasons for which this theory has been, in my view rightly, criticized. My own argument would start by pointing out that the contemporary phenomenology or understanding of moral agency doesn't sustain the conception of double effect that was so crucial to Ramsey's case. My point here is that his argument is difficult to sustain, and if his acceptance of deterrence was contorted, the bishop's, too, was, let's say, uncomfortable and, as some of the bishops later acknowledged, grudging. After stating fairly definitively that the use of nuclear weapons was immoral, the bishops nonetheless, in their pastoral, provided a strictly conditioned moral acceptance, quote unquote, of deterrence, with the proviso that no arms race would be tolerated and that the policy could only be a temporary stage on the path to disarmament. Now again, penetrating and I think successful challenges were made to the coherence of this position, especially given the bishop's acceptance of the empirical premise that an actual nuclear war could not be limited or contained or prevented from escalating. For our purposes, though, today, what's crucial is that the already but not yet provisional acceptance that the bishops granted of deterrence has, in the intervening decades, effectively expired. As it became clear that the security policies of major powers, including the U.S., tended not only to produce no decisive movement toward abolition, but indeed moved toward developing capacities for limited nuclear war fighting, statements began to emerge from the bishops and from the Holy See, we've already heard several quotes from them, suggesting that the conditions that had supported their earlier tolerance of deterrence no longer obtained. Now, this development occurred within a broader move within Catholic thought on war, spurred by John Paul II's sensibilities, as well as by the series of nonviolent regime changes around the world at the end of the 80s, a change marked by a rise in the stock of nonviolence as a Christian and Catholic stance. This shift was reflected in the evolution from the 1983 pastoral's bald statement that, quote, justice is always the foundation of peace, to the title of their follow-up document, 10 years later, we already heard mentioned, which was called The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace. It inverts the relationship between justice and peace. For Catholic pacifists, be they Pax Christi activists or practitioners of civil disobedience, such as the Plowshares movement, nuclear weapons and deterrence had always been non-starters not to be reconciled with a prophetic witness to the solidarity and peace of the body of Christ. Now, at this point, then, something of a convergence has occurred around the world, around the view that a renewed push for disarmament must be the focus of Catholic teaching and action on nuclear weapons, not deterrence, but disarmament. Interestingly, this development has paralleled a different abolition movement, I mentioned as a footnote, that's gathered steam in Catholic circles over roughly the same period, namely the movement for the abolition of capital punishment. Now, onto the Obama administration, President Obama ostensibly shares this view, having proclaimed in his Prague speech a year ago, quote, America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. He also declared his resolve to, quote, put an end to Cold War thinking. This year, in rapid succession, as we've heard, the Obama administration has accumulated a string of opportunities to forge ahead with these objectives in the Nuclear Posture Review, in the START negotiations, in the Global Summit on Nuclear Security here a couple of weeks ago, in the upcoming review conference on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in New York next month. How has President Obama fared so far, given his proclaim of a world without nuclear weapons? In fairness, he's acknowledged that this world is a long-term project that may not be completed in his lifetime. Still, his progress so far, from the abolitionist standpoint I've alluded to, remains modest. Here are a few points backing that claim. First, it's true that the Nuclear Posture Review has included a statement ruling out the use of nuclear weapons on non-nuclear states and in compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's a position that pointedly excludes Iran, for example. This concession still falls short of a more thoroughgoing renunciation of nuclear attacks, no first use statement, a step that was reportedly considered but dropped. Second, the opportunity to declare that the U.S. nuclear arsenal serves a deterrent purpose only was eschewed in favor of the formulation that that is its fundamental role, by implication fundamental but not exclusive role. Third, although no new nuclear warheads or tests are planned at present, the current policy pumps an additional $7 billion into the nuclear budget. Fourth, the recent summit in D.C. did yield a constructive proposal to secure errant nuclear materials around the world within a 4-year time frame. One thing the agreement didn't squarely address, though, was the continued production of weapons-grade uranium and plutonium, at least as far as I know. Fifth, no progress has been made at this time toward the removal of tactical nuclear weapons housed in 5 European countries, a situation arguably in violation of the norms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Indeed, it seems fairly clear that the NPT's obligation under Article 6 to pursue good faith negotiations aimed at disarmament has not been fully honored. The prospect of further reductions through negotiations with Russia, sixth, seems to be stymied by mutual distrust and the refusal of either side to lead beyond a certain point, let me put it that way. Here, arguably, one might expect Obama to take seriously his own claim that, as the only nuclear power to have used a nuclear weapon, the U.S. is under a special obligation to act and take the lead. Just a couple more points. One is that Obama's campaign promise to remove the U.S. system from a policy of so-called hair trigger alert remains unfulfilled at this point. The same goes, finally, for his pledge to push aggressively for the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Of course, we can wait and see how he moves ahead with that. His administration, in short, has much work to do in moving toward the ethical objective of a world without nuclear weapons that he himself has held up and endorsed. In pursuing this goal, he could do worse than to look at the model of one of his predecessors, who noted in his memoirs, see if you can guess who this is, how he came to the realization that, quote, a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. My dream then became a world free of nuclear weapons. For the years I was president, I never let my dream of a nuclear-free world fade from my mind. Some of my advisors, including a number at the Pentagon, did not share this dream. They couldn't conceive of it. The president that I'm thinking of here proceeded to then doggedly, even courageously, set forward his own nuclear agenda. Without judging the particular merits of his strategy, which combined a push for arms reduction with the development of a so-called strategic defense initiative, Yes, Ronald Reagan can't be faulted for the way he took on naysayers in his own administration and moved forward. A role model, perhaps, for Obama. My last topic, moving ahead, a Catholic abolitionist agenda. Reagan might not have been so successful in his efforts were it not for the crucial alliance he forged with one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral James D. Watkins. I mention this because it was not incidental, I think, that Watkins was a Catholic who, although he initially found the bishop's pastoral a, quote, outrage, ended up legitimately engaging with the questions that they raised and gradually moved to a view critical of the then policy of mutually assured destruction. Obama, too, will need such advocates. In this sort of capacity and others, Catholics have a range of valuable roles to play in the pursuit of an ethical nuclear weapons policy premised on disarmament and a strict regime preventing the spread of nuclear capabilities. It's fitting, perhaps, to consider this agenda under the headings of strategic objectives and tactical measures. My list here is a bit different from the others that we've heard. Some tactical points, in addition to ones I've mentioned involving policies. One would be the pursuit of so-called nuclear-free zones, an idea similar to the notion of zones of peace, championed by some scholars of peace studies. Nuclear-free zones in the Middle East and in Europe. Just as important, however, are movements and actions, including actions geared at peace building. Activists have the opportunity in a few days to convene in New York at a conference addressing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, at which none other than Ban Ki-moon will deliver the keynote address. Interfaith work, moreover, will be important in tapping faith-based support for reduction measures. The normal venues of democratic citizenship, too, are vital. And yes, there can even be a place, a tactical place, for targeted civil disobedience in pursuit of abolitionist goals, which is, after all, an American tradition. Strategically, there are some broad goals I want to mention briefly that might go under the heading of visional ethics. And by this I mean not just a utopian ethics, but one that attends to the importance of how we see the world and constitute the shape of the problems that it presents us with. What does it mean, for example, to move beyond Cold War thinking? Obama noted in his Prague speech that, quote, if we believe that the spread of nuclear weapons is inevitable, then in some way we are admitting to ourselves that the use of nuclear weapons is inevitable. Against this sort of belief, we need to contest the notion that possessing nuclear weapons is vital for national security and give greater credence to the view that such weapons make the world more dangerous. One abiding source of visional ethics, is the legacy of Catholic social teaching, which, especially in its post-World War II development, has given important support to the idea of the global common good as an ideal that tempers national sovereignty and reflects a spirit of interdependence and humanitarianism that transforms the set of problems associated with possession of and access to nuclear weapons. As it slowly continues to unfold, Catholic social teaching is also articulating further principles that have deep relevance to the ethics and politics of nuclear weapons regarding ecology, sustainability, and the topic of the most recent encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, namely authentic human development, social, economic development in the context of the dignity of the human person. For nuclear weapons cannot be successfully grasped, much less countered, without a full sense of how their regime is bound up with economic inequalities and unsustainable environmental practices. Finally, visional ethics is a theological exercise that requires, depending on how you view it, the disclosure of a truth to be witnessed to, or the identification of a leap of faith to be taken. Either perspective can be pointed toward by my closing quote from Pope Paul VI. If you wish to be brothers, let the weapons fall from your hands. Thank you.
want to thank all the panelists for your very thoughtful and challenging remarks. And I want to thank all of you for being so patient to get your say. So now I'd like to open it up for the audience for questions and discussion. And please just stand up and give us your name, where you're from, as well as your question. And I'll try to repeat it for the audio portion of our discussion here today. So, questions? Yes.
From Maryland, my name is Hank Ramada, and background for my question, actually I have a number of questions, hopefully we can talk about some of it later, but I've worked I'm a psychologist, and I've worked in the field with emotionally disturbed children and their families for many years. And one of the things that happens is that there are a lot of power and control issues that play out in those relationships. And people have tried things like deterrence in a broader sense in dealing with those. But to me, the thing that stands out has to do more with trust. And I think when we get to the ethics of it, I think there's a lot that can be said about that. But my definition from my work is that trust means that when people have close relationships, they know each other so well that they can hurt each other if they want to exercise power in those relationships. And trust is when you choose not to do that, and the person in that relationship knows that even though you're capable of hurting them, that you choose not to do that. When I think about what the controlling issues are with nuclear weapons, that there seems to be the need for a lot of trust to be developed. Not so much that we don't have the capacity to hurt each other, but that we will choose and demonstrate ways of choosing not to do that. And I wonder what efforts are being made, or could be made, to develop and engender that, that dimension.
Excellent question about the challenges and opportunities to build trust as a basis for further motion. Want to take those on?
I will start because I've actually had many reflections on this very issue through the course of this negotiation, because we had just gone through a very difficult period with the Russian Federation as we embarked on these negotiations. There had been a lengthy period when we had not really been engaged with the Russians on nuclear security matters. There was a certain tendency in the last decade for us both to go our own ways on nuclear security matters and not engage in negotiated reductions or confidence building measures. There were some particular tasks we were working on which were associated with securing fissile material protection, control and accounting, working with the Russians to help them to destroy some of their older missile systems. These were all pursuant to a program that's called the Nunn-Lugar program. It was started by Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar. And what I found, I worked in the Department of Energy, that those kind of bread and butter, very practical programs that brought U.S. and Russian experts together, there was a great degree of trust as a result between even, some very highly technical nuclear experts working in our national laboratories that deal with nuclear weapons and the Russian national laboratories. It was that, that very, very practical work, bringing them together. They had to trust each other because they had a task to accomplish, and they did have a good overall relationship. But when you got away from that to the larger realm of U.S.-Russian relations, in fact, our trust was beginning to crumble. And the culmination of that was the war between Russia and Georgia in August of 2008, when our bilateral relationship hit rock bottom. And I was living in Moscow at the time as the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, and really trying in every way I could to continue what I knew to be, there was the basis for a good relationship there, but the trust between the two countries was completely eroded at that point. And as we embarked on these negotiations, we found time and time and time again that there just was not a storehouse of bilateral trust that would enable us to move forward. So there was a great deal of reconstructive work to be done in the relationship. And in the end, it was, I think, the fact that there were a lot of people on our delegation who had worked, again, whether it was in the Nunn-Lugar program, implementing projects with Russia, lab-to-lab program, implementing programs with Russia, or people who had been involved over the years in implementing the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty as inspectors, and they had built up these personal relationships. So I can't say that a bilateral relationship can be dependent entirely on personal relationships and, you know, kind of pragmatic implementation of policy that allows those personal relationships to prosper. But nevertheless, I do think that it was a significant factor in moving these negotiations forward so quickly, and I hope it will be a significant factor in the implementation of this treaty as well. So I'm only recounting my personal experience in the course of these negotiations to underscore the point you made. And so where you see trust being a factor in familial relations, it is definitely a factor in international relations as well, including in these fundamental matters related to nuclear disarmament. So thank you for your comment.
Chris Gundy with Catholic Review. I'm intrigued by the concept of trying to get to this global zero. And it's in the NPR that as long as there's nukes out there, we'll sustain a safe and secure weapon. But General Barnes, Mr. Burns, I was intrigued by your concept that if we ever get to that point, we'll police this, we'll go out, and if a nation comes up with it, we'll slap them down. But is there really any way to get the genie back in the bottle, as it were? I mean, the knowledge is out there, nuclear material is out there, somebody somewhere, some rogue nation, some non-state actor is going to do this. Is there a way to get to zero and keep it?
The genie is out of the bottle. And as you correctly stated, the knowledge to build nuclear weapons is pretty widespread. You know, almost any physics department in a graduate school can put together a nuclear weapon if they come up with 50 pounds of highly enriched uranium. Now, not a very good weapon by weapon standards today, but it's a nuclear weapon. That's why I say that it will take draconian measures if you go to zero to prevent, because it has to be a never, it can't be a maybe. If one nation or one entity gets a nuclear weapon, then they're a nuclear power, and nobody else is, and you can't tolerate that. So in building to zero, going down, you have to build up a security system, which will be very expensive, to guarantee the world that nuclear weapons will not be used because we will find them before they can be used. And that's a big order. We don't have the technology to do it today, but compared to technology of 20 years ago, perhaps in 20 years we will. You need a way to destroy a missile when it takes off, as an example. You need a way to find, to be able to trace nuclear material of some sufficient quantity so that no one is able to clandestinely mass enough nuclear material to do it. It's a big job. And that's why I say going to zero doesn't prove anything unless you can enforce that zero.
David Cobb with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. I want to thank Catholic University for doing this forum. In addition to the students, my question is Assistant Secretary Gunmore. In addition to the students, there's a lot of staff here from Catholic Organization. And my guess is that everyone in this auditorium supports the strategy, but they also have a lot of other competing demands. While you were gone, the Senate has become increasingly dysfunctional. Senator Inhofe has announced that he plans to take you on to defeat the treaty and believes that he can muster the votes to block the treaty from being ratified. For busy people in the room, can you give a picture for them as to what happens if this treaty is defeated?
It's an excellent question, David, and I do believe that we have some formidable opponents to this treaty. There's no question about it. In my view, the major and the dire result is the unraveling of President Obama's initiative to move toward a world free of nuclear weapons. And that, in an immediate and political sense for this administration, would be a stark and significant blow. But furthermore, I think it would lead to the unraveling of the non-proliferation treaty regime, because over the last, we spoke about trust a moment ago, over the last decade, there has been increasingly a sense that the non-proliferation treaty regime is not the even-handed bargain that it was meant to be when it was put in place in 1968. That is, that the nuclear weapon states would remain nuclear weapon states after the treaty entered into force, but only as long as it took to denuclearize and to proceed toward disarmament. And so that part of the bargain under Article 6 of the NPT, that the United States, Russia, and the other nuclear powers would move toward zero nuclear weapons, that would be seen, I think, as completely discarded at that point. And so there would be the dire effect, I fear, of an unraveling of the non-proliferation treaty and its associated non-proliferation regime. And so I do see quite stark problems emerging if we are not able to move forward with ratifying this treaty and bringing it into force. It's a matter of confidence of the world community in the United States as a leader of the non-proliferation regime, and furthermore of our ability to continue moving down the path toward eventual elimination of nuclear weapons.
My question is, you said that it's immoral to use like nuclear and atomic bombs, and like I know that's based around a lot of religions, the moral ideals. My question is, like in using the atomic bomb, like yeah, it killed a lot of people, and innocent people also. If there were blanket bombings where more people were killed than in the atomic bombs. So what makes it more moral to use blanket bombs just by using more bombs than using one? And the idea of what makes an innocent, or I guess a life of someone in the public, worth more than someone in the army in a war where people are being drafted. So like a 16-year-old boy, does he instantly lose his innocence because he got drafted, even though he's the same as someone who's living over there in Pakistan, where the bombs are dropped? Like, what makes their life, I guess, worth less or better?
Well, a couple parts of your question. One is we needn't assume that fire bombings, cluster bombings are okay, and nuclear weapons or the use of the atomic bomb wasn't. And few people would make that argument. It is the case that the ramifications of using the atomic bomb and the whole history of deterrence and the arms race that follows on that places that in a different class, something with more ramifications than simple applications of conventional weapons. I can recommend Michael Walzer's book, Just and Unjust Wars, for some very specific arguments, both on that question and on the question that you asked of why the rights of soldiers or people who've been conscripted for the military might be different from the rights of civilians. It's complex, but very convincing, I think.
Do you think it would have been better not to drop a bomb than to drop a bomb and have more people die in fighting?
Just on that specific question,
The idea of if you save more lives by dropping it, because I mean at this time not a lot of countries have technology, I know. But what, like I know if someone used it nowadays, it could just be used back and it's a chain reaction. But what I'm saying is the idea of saving more lives. Are you saying as long as you save more civilian lives, that it was a better and more valiant act than if you could save more soldiers' lives in general?
Sure, I would say that you can't in that way. We're talking about judgments of proportionality, that you can't simply trade off civilian lives against the lives of soldiers or the military. And in other words, it's okay to protect soldiers' lives by taking an action that will kill at least as many civilians. So, yeah, I would say that.
what we're really hearing is what Bill pointed out, a convergence of the views of nonviolence and just war, to the point where now the just war has come around to a position that nonviolence has taken, that we really need to move past deterrence and move toward elimination. My question is to Dr. Rose-Gottmuller. I understand that there was a humongous, monumental task to restart negotiations when there was no language, there was no context, there were no relationships. In the year that you've spent now talking with Russian counterparts and banging out this new start, have you gotten a sense, and can you give us any inkling or any hope that in the next round, which the administration has already openly committed to, that we might be able to get at questions of de-alerting, questions of removing delivery vehicles and separating warheads, that we might be able to ratchet down, even before we eliminate these arsenals, and even before we get down to a level where we can bring other nations in? Do you see any hope on the horizon in the next round of START that could give us some encouragement? And I think, as David pointed out, it's going to be a very uphill battle getting this Senate to do anything that will support this administration, regardless of its import. So if you can give us a little view down the road as to what we're setting up with this very modest treaty and what we might be able to hope for in the near future.
I think the core of our goal, and I agree with you that the next treaty, although we will begin to consult with other nuclear powers, but the next treaty negotiation itself will still be with the Russian Federation, because we still have about 90% between the United States and Russia of the nuclear weapons in the world. So we still have a lot of work to do. My view is, and it's been for a long time, that we must set our sights next on warheads and what to do about warheads, because each of the treaties that we've negotiated, starting with the strategic arms limitation treaties in the 1970s, were really about constraining the delivery vehicles. If you have a missile and you cut up the missile, then the warhead can't go anywhere. That's the simplistic way of putting it. So therefore, if there's a bunch of warheads in a storage facility somewhere, as long as there aren't any missiles to launch them, that's fine. That's an okay arms reduction measure. Well, that was linked to the fact that a missile is a huge thing, and you can see it from satellites, from space. You can see it from national technical means. So that's how we got started in the 1970s with this approach, that you don't focus so much on the warheads, but you focus on the missiles that deliver the warheads, or the bombers, whatever system you're using. But that means that there are a lot of warheads in storage. Both of the United States and Russia have steadily been reducing and eliminating warheads over time. Actually, we heard a moment ago about the so-called HEU deal, where we've taken highly enriched uranium from Russian warheads that have been eliminated and turned it into power plant fuel for nuclear power plants. That's a great kind of swords into plowshares program. But it still hasn't addressed the large number of warheads that are kept in storage, because arms control treaties don't touch them. They don't require elimination of warheads. So I think the next goal for our work with Russia is to figure out a way to get at those warheads in storage facilities that are not deployed on missiles, to get at the warheads that are on bases in Europe, so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Those are very, very challenging tasks. And again, to return to the theme of trust, it's going to require us to get to a very deep level of verification with the Russians, that they're able to come to our nuclear weapon storage facilities, our most sensitive national facilities. We're able to go to theirs and make sure that we can follow that they are eliminating and reducing those systems, and the same with us. So I see it as a challenge. It's a challenge, a technological challenge, because we have to have some ways, to do those verification tasks. But it's also a challenge of trust and getting to the point where we're willing, and they are willing, to really get to that level of work together on this sensitive kind of project. So I do believe that's the priority for the next round of negotiations. I know, in talking to my Russian colleagues, that they understand that that's the next round. I can't say that they're willing to jump in both feet forward on the task, because they see, first of all, that it will be challenging. They've got a big job to do. They've got a lot of reduction to take in their own missile forces, because a lot of their systems are obsolete and they need to get rid of them. And they're going to be hard at work at doing that over the next several years. And furthermore, they are very weak in their conventional forces, and they see nuclear weapons as a way to be an insurance policy, to keep them, up on the league tables in the international system, to turn them into maybe a more important power than they otherwise would have been. So there are a lot of issues on the Russian side, but they do recognize what the agenda is for the next stage of negotiations, and they are willing to start talking about it. Maybe not immediately formal negotiations, but figuring out where we go from here in some consultative ways. And so I can see the agenda, I can see the negotiation unfolding, but it's going to take us some time to organize it. And we do have to ratify this treaty first. Absolutely, that is the first priority.
Quick follow-up, and I would also put this to anyone on the panel, especially our bishop. Do you see the emphasis on prompt global strike as being a complicating factor as you move forward with the negotiations with the Russians? And then on a moral level, how do you assess the morality of dramatically increasing this conventional capability as a way of replacing this very deadly unconventional capability in the prompt global strike? And I'm also recognizing that right now prompt global strike is configured with nuclear only. It's just the conventional side that they're going to develop. So I mean, how does that complicate discussions with the Russians in the next round?
Can I add just something to that? With the negotiations with the Russians, also the missile defense system in Eastern Europe. I know that was a sticking point for the Russians, and I don't know how you guys worked through that one, but yeah, I was wondering how that plays into the next round of negotiations, and also if the Catholic Church has a position on missile defense.
Okay, I should let Archbishop O'Brien speak as well, but let me just say briefly that indeed it was precisely those two issues, the missile offense-defense interrelationship and prompt global strike, which is essentially long-range strategic systems like an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or a submarine-launched ballistic missile with a conventional warhead on it rather than a nuclear warhead on it. And the argument for such systems has been that, in fact, they allow us to go after targets we can't get at quickly otherwise. Like suddenly we see, we get good intelligence and we know Osama bin Laden's hiding in this cave in Pakistan. And we want to be able to send a system there very quickly to get him. So we launch a ballistic missile that flies to that place within 15, 20 minutes, but not with a nuclear warhead, with a conventional warhead on it. To be honest, I have had personally grave concerns about this for the years that we have been discussing this, and we aren't yet to the point where we have decided actually to deploy such systems, but they are very much under consideration because of the concerns about terrorism. But in my view, it's a very, very dangerous road to take because of the problems with the Russian Federation. What if they see an ICBM being launched? Are they suddenly going to take that as warning of an attack? So there are a lot of problems with the prompt global strike system that came up during our negotiations. The Russians themselves are very, very concerned about this. I think these are problems we can wrestle with as long as we are increasing levels of mutual confidence and trust, as long as we have, very, very intensive consultations, maybe some joint warning systems of various kinds. We understand their warning system, they understand ours, but we're not at that point yet in our relationship. That's work that still needs to be done, homework that still needs to be done. So perhaps Archbishop O'Brien would like to speak further.
I still swear by the traditional just war principles, and I think it would be foolhardy to say that we are going to diminish and do away with nuclear weaponry, but we're going to increase our capability for destroying the world with conventional weapons. Right now, we can destroy the universe 10 times over with the conventional weapons we have. So while we're concentrating on nuclear weaponry, I think we have to address the conventional weaponry too, always keeping in mind that self-defense is a right. And when you come to terrorism and new questions arise every year, almost every day, as to the changing face of warfare and self-defense, we have some very conscientious people doing these negotiations, and I think they have to be alert to these questions, and we as a moral force have to keep bringing up these principles, these just war principles, that indiscriminate killing, proportionate principles have to be taken into effect, and sometimes we can do more harm than good in seeking to defend a good nation and good principles that we stand for. So I say just war, that's where the church comes in. And we are always ready to pose those questions and say, are these principles being considered as you are getting into these technicalities such as missile defense systems and so forth?
Just let Marie Dennis get the last question. We'll beg your forgiveness for going slightly over, and then we do invite you all to the reception now. Go ahead, Marie.
Marie Dennis with the Marymount Office for Global Concerns and Pax Christi International. I actually would like to add a question to Dr. Butler also. You mentioned the ultimate move to a more multilateral negotiation following the starting process. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how far off you see actually engaging powers that are not part of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime yet, including Pakistan, India, etc. And I also noticed that you did not mention Israel, and I wonder if that you see any possibility that Bill's image of nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East is even slightly possible.
Those are excellent questions, and we didn't really have much chance to talk about other items on the agenda for the NPT review conference coming up. But one item on the agenda is what to do to carry forward the goals that were set forth in 1995 in the review conference, when there was a very important resolution that talked about issues in the Middle East with regard to all the countries in the Middle East, including Israel, that never admits to having nuclear weapons, but certainly has been suspected of having nuclear weapons for many years now. And so the question of how and in what circumstances can we move forward to having more cooperation in the Middle East overall, having a settlement to the Middle East problems, and moving forward to consider in future a nuclear weapons of mass destruction, not only nuclear weapons-free zone, but weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. That is certainly something that's been on people's minds now since, well, for a long time, but certainly it was pulled into sharp focus in 1995 in the NPT review conference at that time. And it will be a subject for discussion at this review conference starting next week. So I think those matters, people are grappling with the very questions that you point to, and trying to figure out how to re-energize that agenda of discussions in the Middle East, not only involving Israel, of course, but also the Arab states in the Middle East. With regard to turning to other countries, I would say, interestingly enough, that we've already succeeded in engaging Pakistan and India. The very fact that this time last year they were ready to acquiesce to a fissile material cutoff treaty negotiation in the Conference on Disarmament. Now, of course, we all recognize Pakistan has since thrown a wrench in the works, and they've kind of backed away from that, but they are part of the active engagement at this point. They are part of the discussion about where we go with nuclear weapons and fissile material in the future, and I would only expect that to continue and to expand. We need to figure out a way responsibly to get them to step up to the responsibilities in the non-proliferation regime, the responsibilities that are inherent to those who have fissile material first and foremost, but also those who deploy nuclear weapons. So I think that we're already in the course of engaging them, sometimes with more success than on other occasions. We're at a bad patch right now with Pakistan, but as I mentioned in my remarks, nevertheless, I'm hopeful that we can overcome the wrench that they've thrown into the works and get to work on a fissile material cutoff negotiation in the CD.
I want to thank again all our speakers for your generous gift of your time and presence to be here with us today to discuss these issues. Thank you for all the members of the audience for coming out, especially during the last week of classes. And please, if you didn't get to ask your question, feel free to join in during the reception afterwards, have a drink and discussion, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you all.